Good morning, Sabah al Khair. So welcome to day 2 of Colorful Threads, the interwoven worlds of art and culture. This morning's panel is titled Cinema and Placemaking. We have 3 distinguished speakers as well as a distinguished discussant who will get our conversation going. We will begin with Debashree Mukherjee, followed by James Burns and Bindu Menon. Without further ado, please.
Okay, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you so much to Laura and Preeta for inviting me. This has already been such an amazing symposium. Thank you to the Africa Institute and the Sharjah Art Foundation, and this entirely brilliant team of people, including the videographers who are capturing us from the minute we step off the bus. So it's hard work, thank you. Okay, so I've changed the title of the promise paper a little bit. So now what I'm going to present is going to be called Cinema's Archipelagic Poetics, the story of a Chinese film in Mauritius. So in today's paper, I want to think through cinema as a form of archipelagic poetics. That is a form that connects embodied experiences across oceans and territorial geographies. My focus is on the 1930s, the heyday of diasporic film consumption, when movies became talkies and started to speak in specific languages, even as nationalisms of various kinds started to rear their heads. The place from which I begin my journey is Mauritius. My interest is in communities that made this place their home and how, through the films they watched, we might center the experience of migrant labor, particularly what is called coolie labor in Indian Ocean worlds. Now, according to G. Balachandran, the emblematic coolie is the indentured laborer bound by contractually imposed and legally enforced unfreedoms. However, coolie is also one of several terms used to describe a more generic figure in laboring society, namely a mobile wage worker, unstable of residence, location, and employment, possessing volitions that were unknowable, unstable, and impervious to modern methods of regulation. Now, cinema, like the coolie, is fundamentally mobile and frequently ungovernable. But here, I don't want to emphasize this connection. I want to emphasize another connection between cinema and the coolie experience that speaks to our long-standing presumptions about modernity, modernity's geographic coordinates, and modernity's individual constituents. And that connection of cinema, the coolie subject, and modernity, for me, is via labor. Cinema's historical imbrication with labor has been noted by theorists of early cinema and modernity, such as Miriam Hansen, Tom Gunning, Mary Ann Doan, and several others. The argument broadly is that the moving image presented the urban moviegoer with a sensorial education in modernity's shocks and ruptures, even as movie-going became a mass form of entertainment that would socially reproduce the proletariat's labor power. Now, this influential research, and it's just the shorthand for it is the modernity thesis in cinema studies. This influential research was based on studies of Hollywood and Euro-American spectators. Subsequently, scholars working on other parts of the world took up this modernity thesis to explore what fit and what didn't fit in other urban centers outside England and the United States. By taking seriously the screening of a Chinese film in 1930s Mauritius, I hope to bring into view a different kind of laboring spectatorial constituency, that is, the manual laborer in the tropical colony. This is not the proletariat in the factory, but it's the immigrant coolie working on roads, mines, and plantations in Europe's colonial network of extractive industries. Many watched these films that I will discuss soon as workers. Many others processed their diasporic identity as foreign workers through these films. and often at a generational remove from their coolie ancestors, because I'm talking about the 1930s. Now, in the films that circulated most widely across the Indian Ocean in the 30s, we see several recurring tropes of mobility, a through line and a theme for this entire conference. Some of these tropes of mobility included fantastic tales from the Arabian Nights story cycle, where mobility is a kind of everyday magic, or rags to riches dreams of social mobility in some of these films from Bombay in the 1930s, or romanticized images of workers asserting their rightful place in history as makers of infrastructure, and hence building the invisible undergirding of the material world that keeps human society moving, again, mobility. Now, these films were not made by displaced and diasporic peoples. These films that I'm showing were made in late colonial India, but the gesture towards an archipelagic becoming across Asia, Europe, and Africa, one that predates the nation state and that was made up of a desire for cinema. Together, they index the coerced and voluntary migrations that brought multilingual, multi-ethnic audiences into a Mauritian movie theater. Now, though this panel has been titled Cinema and Placemaking, I'm taking a slightly different itinerant route to place via circulation and the surprising histories of film reception. My objective is threefold. This pink looked much better on my laptop, sorry. So one, I want to cast a cinematic lens on the actually existing entanglements of peoples and places across the Indian Ocean. Two, to trouble one of the most stubborn frameworks in film studies that refuses to exit, that of national cinema. And finally, to argue for new frames of film analysis that take place seriously but go beyond it. Perhaps this is an archipelagic poetics that insists on formal resonances, such as themes that are drawn from the existential conditions of life. And in today's case, those existential conditions that I want to focus on are manual labor under coolie conditions. Now, drawing on theorizations of the archipelagic nature of the Caribbean via Edward Glisson and Derek Walcott, the editors of this 2020 anthology approach the archipelago as a space-time configuration forged out of the multiple journeys of peoples from one continent to another. So it's a kind of a spatio-temporal formation that is assembled but can also be reassembled through careful bonds of love, storytelling, and memory. Now this is just as a reference. There is intergenerational pain and loss here, but also the possibility of remaking the self and negotiating the difference of the other. And I'm going to cite from the editor's introduction in this book, coerced diasporas and voluntary displacements, colonialism and imperialism, global capitalism and modernity are all implicated as the forces scattering these painful, ill-fitting, scarred fragments from their original continents and restoring them into a different imaginary and narrative in the so-called islands of the sea. An Apelli Haufa reference. For Michelle Stephens and Yolanda Miguel, the archipelagic is a framework to theorize multiplicity and difference while undoing central tenets in historical and literary studies. And for them, those central tenets are in history, teleology, and in literature, the epic. Instead, embracing the multifocal, multi-sided articulation of human experience. Now, for me, this active mode of archipelagic thinking offers a counter-spatialization that can exceed normative frames for understanding relations between diaspora and homeland, colonizer, colonized, territory and identity, and indeed, as several of us discussed yesterday, insider and outsider. An archipelagic poetics, then, would follow stories, characters, tropes that help us recognize patterns of aesthetic imagination that join continents and times. So the focus here would be on affect, intimacy, embodiment, and world making, which to my mind is a little bit different from placemaking. Now, the central artifact of my presentation today is a Chinese film that screened at the Theatre Municipal de Port Louis in 1937. And the film is called Highways, directed by Sun Yu, and it came out in 1935 in China. Now, the film was shown twice in Mauritius in February 1937 as a special screening to mark the Chinese New Year. But first, a little bit of a background on cinema in Mauritius, and I'll leave it to my co-panelist James Burns to give you the detailed version. Now, there doesn't yet exist any comprehensive history, and actually not even a basic timeline of early cinema in Mauritius. So what I'm presenting is a very slow, tedious work in progress based on local newspaper accounts, advertisements, oral interviews, and snippets from British and American government publications. Now, because the research and its challenges speak volumes to the status of Mauritius and the status of its film history in the global scheme of things, including in the Global Academy, I'll be happy to talk about archival methods and research questions in the Q&A. Now, the first films that were screened in Mauritius, the first films were screened in 1897. Now, the Lumiere brothers had only recently premiered their cinematograph films as the latest technological marvel in Paris in 1895. And by 1896, audiences across New York, Durban, Sydney, Bombay, and Shanghai had glimpsed their first moving pictures. Port Louis, the capital of Mauritius, had long been a key nodal point along French and British colonial shipping routes, though this status had changed after the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. The earliest public film screenings that I've been able to verify through newspaper notices are from February and March 1897. And for those that know a little bit about the centrality of the Paul et Virginie legend to Mauritius, one of the first films screened was of Paul and Virginia. Now, the theater where the film was screened is the Theatre Municipal de Port Louis, and it's said to be the oldest theater or playhouse in the Southern Hemisphere. It was inaugurated in 1822 and remained a very significant venue for public entertainment well into the 1930s. Local historians suggest that the island's first dedicated cinema theater was opened in 1915. And we'll hear perhaps more about that soon. And I'm getting these timekeeping messages, so I'll rush through. Films were imported, and the colonial government charged customs import duties on each print. The chief countries from where films arrived were France, America, England, India, and China, in that order. Minor imports also came in from Germany and Italy. Now, in 1930, the U.S. Department of Commerce undertook a survey of what it called small island markets for American motion pictures and compiled a brief but very detailed survey of film screening facilities in Mauritius. The write-up on Mauritius was by the American consul in Durban, South Africa, Gaston Smith, and he prophesied that if and when talking pictures make their way to Mauritius, they would have to be in French. And thereby hangs a tale. Talkies or talking films were first exhibited in Mauritius in 1932. And as I said, the greatest imports were coming from France, England, and America. But by 1937, huge numbers, there was an exponential growth in terms of film imports from India, and a fairly substantive number from China. What this tells us is that Indian film imports grew exponentially in the 30s, paving the way for the full-fledged craze for Hindi and Tamil language feature films in Mauritius by the 1940s. So by the time that we get to 1937 that I'm interested in, the municipal theater was playing Indian films on a regular basis and in the prime screening times, which were Saturday nights and Sunday afternoons, while also showing a full slate of French and English films. And this is where my interest in cinema in Mauritius springs from. The fact that Mauritius and its sizable Indian and Indo-Mauritian population, born out of a century of indentured labor migration, was one of the first film export territories for Indian cinema. Now, why have historians of Indian cinema never studied this circulation history? It might have to do with the fact that the old diaspora troubles the timeline of Indian cinema's global reach, even as it offers up an inappropriate working class and working caste viewing audience. So the focus has generally been on the newer white-collar diaspora in the US and the UK from the 1970s onwards. I'll just give you a little sampling of the kinds of films being screened in Mauritius in 1937. So this was a very popular film starring one of the biggest stars in Bombay at the time, Miss Gohar, Glorious Gohar. And the film is called Barrister's Wife. And it's taking center stage alongside these two Hollywood films. And on another day, you see this film, Hatem Tai, having multiple reruns over and over again alongside weird cowboy Indian movies from Hollywood and another modern Bombay film, Bombay Ki Sethani. Now, I've been researching Bombay's dynamic film culture for a long time, especially in the 1930s. But I was taken aback by the multilingual, multi-origin film exhibition culture in Port Louis in this decade. It is really something remarkable, pointing to the heady and complex migrations of peoples from 3 continents, Asia, Europe, and Africa. The mere presence of these films speaks to the historically deep roots of the linguistic communities in this place, who were there not as tourists or itinerant merchants, but as settled multi-generation communities. Thus it is that in 1937, at the height of the talkie craze, the Municipal Theatre plays this film that was 2 years old already and shot as a silent film. How did highways make it to Mauritius and why was it there? So I've been told that I don't have very much more time. I'll just quickly tell you what the film was about. So the film is advertised as Highways, starring Lilian Chan and Lily Lai, presented by the United Photography Service Pictures. All these details are incorrect. So with a little bit of digging, I was able to establish that the film is actually a film called Dalu, The Great Road. It was produced by the Lianhua, very legendary talkie studio in Shanghai. And the names of the stars were actually Li Lili and Chen Yan Yan. And this is an image from the studio. That's the director. These are the main actresses. In the interest of time, I'll just give you a synopsis of what I was going to do with the rest of this presentation, which is to think a little bit about the content of the film itself. It's called Highway, the Great Road. It's about the construction of a particular road. And it's presented, this kind of road building is presented as voluntary, unpaid work, but very joyful labor. A long history of Chinese presence in Mauritius from at least the 18th century, some of it as coolie labor, but a lot of it as trading, a merchant class presence with a vibrant Chinatown, and a very kind of close imbrication of the idea, definition, and history of the coolie as an imbrication of Indians and Chinese peoples together. And I wanted to kind of connect that with a few other road films, and this is a film called just Mauritius, produced by a British company called the African Film Productions. And it's a film that still is available at the BFI in 13 minutes. It ends very abruptly, and it ends with this sequence, with this title that says Road Menders. And then you see these images, what seems to be South Asian indentured workers, and it abruptly ends at this point. So there was, in the larger version of this, I wanted to be able to do something with thinking about these images and stories about road building, but not in Mauritius, of Mauritius, from Mauritius, but indexing various other kinds of labor forms to perhaps think about what an archipelagic poetics as method might allow us to see and escape this idea of Mauritian cinema, Chinese cinema, Indian cinema, and think through some other routes. So thank you for your patience, and yeah, thank you.
Thanks. I'd like to echo Debashree's appreciation for the invitation here and the very stimulating meetings I've gotten to participate in already. And now I'm going to also echo a lot of what she just said because we're doing very similar topics. So, my paper, Cinema and Public Leisure in Colonial Mauritius. This paper examines cinema going on the Indian Island Ocean of Mauritius during the colonial era. This presentation provides a narrative of the spread of cinema from the arrival of the first traveling shows, 1897, to the peak years of the cinema's popularity in 1968. By that year, the island's per capita cinema attendance rivaled that of urban areas in North America and Europe. The study aspires to make several historiographical interventions. Within the field of new cinema history, it adds to a growing number of case studies of cinema going in the global South. Scholars in this field have long lamented how little is known about the social history of cinema in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Thus, a study of movie-going in Mauritius brings us incrementally closer to a truly global understanding of cinema's history. But such a study is much more than an exercise in academic completism. During the colonial era, the island's robust and eclectic embrace of moviegoing was unique in Britain's empire. Fans in Mauritius attended the movies in prodigious numbers, embracing stars and genres from all over the globe. While Hollywood proved popular in the early silent era, by the late 1930s, audiences in Mauritius were, as you've seen, ardent fans of films from France, India, as well as the United States. Their eclectic tastes were reflected in the names they gave their movie theaters, such as the Ganesha, the Hollywood, the Paris, and the Odeon. On these screens, audiences saw films from Hollywood and London, but also Paris, Chennai, Mumbai, and Shanghai. Such a study also contributes to our understanding of media flows across the Western Indian Ocean in the late 19th and 20th centuries. At the turn of the 20th century, Mauritius enjoyed a unique, vibrant culture of public leisure, dominated by Francophone European plantocracy. But it was also at the center of several overlapping circuits of entertainment that linked the island and neighboring Réunion and Madagascar, as well as to the East African ports of Mombasa, Zanzibar, and Durban. Some of these networks ran along older paths of commerce and entertainment. Others were initiated for the express purpose of disseminating the new medium. Almost all of the entrepreneurs who controlled these networks were South Asian merchants whose understanding of local markets proved critical to the creation of a dynamic cinema culture. Finally, a study of the movies in Mauritius illuminates the largely undocumented story of the circulation of Bollywood throughout the South Asian diaspora in the late colonial period. There's a robust scholarship on global Bollywood that recognizes the profound impact of films from India on diasporic populations. Scholars from myriad disciplines have observed the profound impact that Bollywood had through music, through language, through images in places like Guyana, Trinidad, Fiji, Mauritius, East Africa, and many other areas of extensive indentured settlement. Yet there's been relatively little empirical study of the circulation or reception of these films. Where and when were they screened? Who saw them and under what circumstances? How did these films circulate from island to island, city to city, and village to village? How were they viewed by the colonial state, and how did this relationship inform their circulation? These are questions that have been largely hypothesized up till now with relatively little empirical evidence, and part of this presentation will be an ArcGIS map I've put together that has mapped almost 100 movie theaters in Mauritius that I'll get to at the end to just kind of show you a framework for understanding the circulation of film on the island. And this is a map showing the 5 areas under review for this project. This project emerged out of my research for the book Cinema and Society in the British Empire, 1895 to 1940, which looked at the spread of movie-going as it took root across 3 continents before the Second World War. In researching that book, it became apparent that it was in the late 1930s that movie-going began to catch on with masses in most colonies. This was particularly true in those containing large South Asian populations. This led me to a study of cinema going in apartheid South Africa in Durban, and research for that project demonstrated the profound social and cultural influence of Bollywood in that city. It also revealed connections between those audiences in Durban and communities stretching across the British Empire. My work on Durban and Mauritius is part of a project that analyzes cinema going in these different 5 countries. While there are many other countries around the world where diasporic communities consume Bollywood, Suriname, for example, I focused on these 5 sites because they were part of the British Empire. The empire created cinema circuits that passed laterally from territory to territory without any connection to the imperial metropole. Empire effectively confined these media flows within the boundaries of British territories. Films might circulate from Trinidad to British Guyana or from Nigeria to Gold Coast, but rarely outside of those circuits of distribution. I also chose to focus on regions where South Asian diasporic populations made up a plurality, or as is in the case of Mauritius, a majority of the population. In these territories, South Asian films enjoyed a particularly profound cultural resonance and relevance. Ultimately, this is a project about cultural agency, about the ways in which local merchants and movie fans initiated and shaped global media flows. There's a common sense assumption that because there were large populations of South Asians in Mauritius, the island's popular culture would be dominated by films from India. But Indian cinema had strong competition from the cinema of other countries, as we've seen already this morning, as audiences picked films based on a constellation of tastes and preferences. It was not uncommon in Mauritius for the same theater to show Raj Kapoor one night and Elvis Presley the next. But it's a project that's equally about the way culture is transmitted, absorbed, and interpreted. Throughout much of the 20th century, colonial administrators, European elites, nationalist politicians, and academics decried the cinema as an agent of Americanization. Yet in Mauritius, under British rule, the cinema spoke Hindi, Tamil, French, and English, although in different accents from time to time. It reinforced cultural relationships with France and with India to the public in a British colony. In Mauritius, the movie business was run by local merchants with a keen interest in meeting the diverse taste of their audience. At no point in the cinema's rich history was it presented in public discourse as an instrument of Western hegemony. I am going to skip all the background and get of Mauritius history, which I think many of you must know by now. The cinema arrives in 1897, and by 1915, the cinema is a going concern on the island. There's some discussion about where the first kind of permanent cinema was set up, and this is a handbill from 1913 of one of these traveling cinema shows, and the Luna Park was one of the first cinemas established, maybe in 1912. There's some discrepancy. One of the other earlier ones was the Le Cinema Rose Hill, 1914. The first movies appear to have been movies were a going concern on the island by the time Ibrahim Achia built Le Cinema Hall in Rose Hill in 1914. Achia was the first of many Gujarati immigrants to venture into the cinema business. His biographer describes him as a self-taught engineer who was a pioneer of electrification on the island. His Rose Hill cinema launched a business that would flourish over the next 5 decades. These early theaters catered to all audiences, and by the end of the First World War, a broad swath of the public had begun to frequent the cinema. In 1920, a Singapore newspaper reported, quote, "Mauritius already possesses 7 picture theaters, and the number is to be increased in order to cover every district." By 1921, there was enough of a market for films in Mauritius that the South African Schlesinger Company advertised it as a link in its distribution chain that ran throughout Britain's African empire. During the 1920s, the cinema became one of the most popular forms of public leisure for the masses. A key moment came in 1922 when Hossan Rawat purchased the Port Louis Theatre and Variety Show Company from a French entrepreneur, thereby earning Rawat, quote, "the credit for developing the cinema into a flourishing industry." The Rawat family was purchasing the theater business and not the property itself, which, as we've heard, is a venerable theater built in 1822. Rawat was, like Achia, descended from Gujarati merchants who had come to Mauritius in the late 19th century. Initially, the films screened in Mauritius were cheap American productions. If I have a chance in the Q&A, I'll come back to this. This is an artifact from a fascinating collection in museum of antique cinema paraphernalia. Initially, the films screened in Mauritius were cheap American productions shipped from South Africa. These early films concerned colonial officials and inspired the island's government to create a censorship board. But in the late 1920s, America's dominance of the island screens was in jeopardy, initially from films from France, as we've seen, but eventually by films from India as well. When exactly the first film from India appeared in Mauritius is unclear. A 1928 newspaper article describes films from India as in demand, If this was the case, they were likely reaching Mauritius from East Africa, where films from South Asia were already being screened deep in the interior of the Lakes region by this point. One scholar asserts that the first Indian film was screened in Mauritius in 1930. If they were being screened in 1930, they were not being advertised in the newspaper, as the first newspaper advertisements for Indian films don't appear. I couldn't find any before 1932. During the 1930s, Indian and French films, as you saw, kind of took the island by storm, and 4 companies came to dominate the film market in this period. They were the Mauritius Cinema Corporation, which is run by the Achia family, the Allied Cinema Corporation, which is fascinatingly run by several RAF pilots who had fought in the First World War and then come to Mauritius to start a movie company. The International Cinema Consortium, which was still runs movie theaters in Mauritius today. And in 1940, Mauritius's film industry became connected to the Majestic Movie Company of Mombasa, Kenya, which began importing films from East Africa, Indian films from East Africa, into Mauritius. In 1940, there were an extraordinary number of cinemas on the island, given its relatively small population. Dozens of them advertised daily in the local newspapers. In 1942, a Colonial Office report indicated that there were 49 cinemas, and this is kind of the drop the mic moment of this presentation. This is a comparison to the cinemas in Mauritius with other colonies in Britain's empire that had very dynamic cinema-going cultures. Mauritius has 49 cinemas with a population that is basically the same of Trinidad. Trinidad has a very similar history and demographic, and yet it's Mauritius is just a fascinating story of the saturation of cinema on the island. Post-Second World War sees a further boom in cinema building and cinema going. But the theaters built after the war now have names like Roshini, Raj, New Delhi, Naz, Lotus, Durga, Anand, and Baroda, as well as names like Florida and Hollywood, which suggest that Indian and American films have eclipsed French films, at least for the period of the early 1960s. By 1957, a Colonial Office report said that on an island with 500,000 people, 3.7 million movie tickets were sold every year, and another 250,000 people went to mobile cinema shows. And this is an ad for this, the mobile cinema shows in one of the island's Hindi newspapers. Okay. By the 1960s, when America and Europe had stopped going to the movies because of television, places like Mauritius had among the highest per capita cinema going in the world. And this is a fascinating document I found at this archive in Port Louis, which is just a huge stack of old Bollywood posters. And on the back of this one is this wonderful sign that was flipped for the purposes of because I'm running out of time, I'll just say this is a map that I've constructed of the dozens and dozens of cinemas on this island, which will provide, it's going to be made publicly available for people who frequent things like this, the social media sites, which will get 1,000 engagements on a posting about a cinema in Mauritius. And the idea is to make this map available, to crowdsource it, to allow people to have this very strong nostalgic connection to the movies, to be able to provide a kind of social media oral history of these venues and these experiences. I think I'm out of time. I've what? Oh, well then I'll just show you. At the bottom, these are 2 other presentations I've done, one about the Caribbean and one about Durban, and each of them also have these maps on them, and eventually I will create a GIS map showing all of these theaters that were showing Bollywood in 5 different countries. I know those aren't the only 5 countries, but that's as much as I can. But so far, I've got about 1,000 theaters in this database, and when it's made publicly available, again, there'll be an opportunity for the public to provide feedback about their own experiences at these theaters. So, thank you.
Good morning, and thanks to the organizers, Jeremy, Rita, and Laura, and the African Institute for making this possible. And I'm quite very happy to join this very rich conversations, that is, very stimulating conversations in the last 2 days, particularly this panel, Debashree, whom I know for many years, and James Burns, whom I have read and used and engaged with. So it's quite a nice experience. So in both of their presentations, that is, we get a very fine understanding of the specificity of the island as a place and processes of island making through cinema. The island that I am trying to talk about today is positioned slightly differently. One, it is not. It never has the status of a nation state, right? It's still at the fringes of the Indian nation state. And in the present, and it's actually the present which has invited me to this whole research project. Its present is something, the Lakshadweep Island is something which is at the verge of extinction, positioned between, climate change, but also climate change that is a result of very extractive, neoliberal extractive measures, as well as threats about the loss of autonomy of the island communities and so on. So it's it's this moment of crisis that invites researchers like me to go into exploring Lakshadweep's history, and particularly film history. So in more than one way, then tracing the Lakshadweep media histories was an invitation for me to rethink disciplinary boundaries, and also develop ways to move beyond very territorially sealed nationalist frameworks of media histories, but also to expand the disciplinary boundaries of Indian Ocean studies. The difficulties inherent in this process are perhaps most evident when we try to challenge the notions of Lakshadweep as a seamlessly continuous extension of mainstream film cultures in India. In many ways, Lakshadweep is seen as an extension or a place of consumption of media products from elsewhere. It's rarely seen as something which produces its own media. So very quickly for those who are unfamiliar with the Lakshadweep Islands, it's the Coral Archipelago, a group of 35 islands in the Indian Ocean, the Lakshadweep, Maldives, Chagos group of islands, and has been a very complex contact zone of languages, food, religious, and cultural practices. It's also a Muslim majority union territory of the Indian Republic, and the island communities are classified as scheduled tribes since 1956, making it a very complex and layered identity. As I said, the renewed attention on Lakshadweep owes to the recent proposed measures of the Indian state of taking away its autonomy and taking away the administrative autonomy primarily, and more methods of extractive neoliberal economic maneuvers in the island. Now, speaking in cinematic terms, I zoomed into Lakshadweep from the margins of film history to island studies, a field that is populated with concepts that intersect and sometimes contradict, such as insularity, islandness, and new approaches that conceptualize islands as assemblages, and methods like the archipelagic that Debashree talked about, to rethink the relations between the islands. Sorry. This move to the archipelagic then enables us to think relationally between islands in a manner that destabilizes islands as static and insular, and instead conceives them as mobile, shaped through forces that are simultaneously centrifugal and centripetal, and in relation to humans, non-human species, objects, and elements. The conjuncture of the archipelagic with the field of Indian Ocean Studies helps me to not just frame the current moment of crisis, but also to decenter the terra-centric and continental narratives of the Indian nation state, which my material will show. To this kind of theoretical carousel, which was very well explained by others, I would like to add the question of elemental aspects of island life as they speak to media imaginaries. And I propose that such elemental aspects have enabled the template to imagine the island in both state-produced mainstream film imaginaries and the current indigenous media-making process. How do we tell a story of media insularity, a creation of both state and commercial neglect, as well as a story of emerging media connections? And how might we map the connectivity among littoral societies to screen imaginaries, desires, and exposure? And what tropes, idioms, and aesthetic elements persist and what gets reconstituted, reimagined, and ruptured? So the first half I explore of this paper, I try to explore the medial dimension of island making, focusing on films that were made by this Indian, state agency of filmmaking, Films Division of India, radio and state-owned radio, television, etc. And in the second part, I try to briefly present the recent proliferation of island media and trans-archipelagic filmmaking networks. So the spread across a period of 50 years and disparate time points, these films offer a discourse on complex systems, metaphors, and relations that has come to define the island. The Films Division of India in 1948 was established under the Department of Information and Broadcasting Ministry, and its primary task was to produce and distribute non-commercial documentaries and news magazines to publicize the government's work and maintain a record of India's history on reel. Now, conceived as programs that are targeting simple and backward rural audiences, the FDI programming included documentaries on themes of development, 5-year plans, agriculture industry, and similar themes of progress. And they primarily explored two styles of filmmaking, the newsreels and the documentary. Very quickly, this is a UNI news on the broadcasting of the All India Radio Calicut station, which is located in mainland Kerala, and broadcasting daily programs to Lakshadweep, and the Minicoy Islands in the Lakshadweep language of U.A.E, right? So the Lakshadweep Islands don't speak the mainland Indian languages, but over the years they have been educated in English, Hindi, and Malayalam, which is the closest territory to the Lakshadweep Islands, and there is quite a bit going on between this kind of this sort of translation, non-availability of local language programming, etc. So if we were to look at the newsreels, which were a large number of newsreels produced by the Films Division in the 1950s and 60s, very quickly the newsreels are news of the moment usually and might have considerable overlap with the documentary form. But their enunciation of the world, as the Indian film theorist Ravi Vasudevan argues, is through segmentation by ways of modes of address observable in early Indian cinema, and specifically the genre of the mythological film, which primarily means that these are newsreels speak in God's voice, and and create a mode of address that is one of devotion. And here it is about the nation state and its citizens. Newsreels are often deployed to present a narrative about institutions, practices, social, cultural, and political references that are less debatable in the reference and are more durable in their exhibition value. Newsreels in their cultural registers might overlap with the documentary. How many minutes do we have? 10 minutes, okay. So these are just screenshots from some of the first newsreels. The Films Division of India made a few documentaries. The prominent of them are listed here. Until the 1990s and the arrival of the video technology, Lakshadweep film culture was primarily regulated by the state agencies who regularly organized public screenings of Indian films, Film Division documentaries, Hindi, and occasionally Malayalam films, and a small number of Tamil films as well. The first such screenings one could trace back is around 1956. The first Films Division documentary on the archipelago titled Lakshadweep, which was made in 1974, turned the camera to a survey mode to the colonial surveys of caste communities of the subcontinent. And it has, there was subsequently 5 more films that the Films Division produced, which were somewhere between a newsreel and a documentary and would assess progress and development of life in the islands. And they included basically a survey of religious practices, festivals, dance performances, etc. But what is interesting, and then very quickly, if one looks at the last 30, 40 years of documentary production in various time periods by different agencies, also mainstream film production, one could easily see, and I'll return to it later, we'll see that many of the opening sequences have this kind of aerial shots of the island. So they move into the island through one or the other kind of aerial shots. And the intimate relationship between the elevated eye and planning gives way to, as we understand, an elemental aesthetic reality, such an aeriality, which resides in the distanced or objective appreciation that is afforded by thinking of islands as very stable objects of either the waterscape or the landscape, but in a wider atmospheric involvement. Moreover, even the general sense of emotional effusion in a beautiful place here is projected rather than recognized. Now, across these images, then we have an ensemble that is simultaneously beautiful and extraordinarily banal. The task, when shifted from bureaucratic planning to fictional film work, entails a different kind of cinematographic practice. Placed alongside, they demonstrate the symbolic roles and effects of aerial view with regard to the emblematically modern project and island making. So, this is a mainstream Malayalam film made in 1977 titled Dweepa by a filmmaker, Mukherjee. It was set in Lakshadweep. It's mainly about a relationship between mainland Kerala and Lakshadweep and people moving, stories of relations, connections forged between the two places. And this is a kind of a letter that the protagonist, who's a school teacher who arrives in the island to teach in the primary school, writes letters to his father back home, where he describes the island. So this kind of static aesthetic imagination of the Films Division starts changing by the 1980s in a certain revival that happens within the Films Division. An important film which makes this shift is Everlasting Now, which is made in 1985 by Umesh Segal, who leverages the advantages offered by a docufiction style of filmmaking, and imagines an invisible narrator who seeks salvation in Lakshadweep and locates humans in the multiplicity of a symbiogenic world. So these are some of the screen grabs from the film. The film moves to thinking about multiple material traces that surrounds the island's life, such as a long history of shipwrecks about the first place led to the habitation of the islands. The shipwrecks have often been overridden by colonial epistemologies and forms of racialized violence, as we know. Now, all of this aeriality, this elemental aspects of Lakshadweep gets a very different turn in contemporary filmmaking, right? So all of them work with, the ocean floor, the flora and fauna, water, air, the shipwrecks, and so on. But in contemporary filmmaking, so for example, this is a 2018 film, begins with this aerial shot. The digital turn has propelled the archipelago into cyberspace and is explored by local filmmakers to great advantage. And this was very crucial in the campaign called Save Lakshadweep after the proposed measures were announced by the Indian government. They often move beyond the desire to represent and present heterogeneous mix and are made in the island languages of Jesseri, Mahal, and Delhi, and Divehi, and are often subtitled in Malayalam. The trans-elemental relations on screen we see across the films division documentaries is presenting a different set of relations in the contemporary films, unassuming in nature, but also very pronounced, in these aspects. How do we read these films, for example, as not just a neutral background, but lively forces that shape culture, politics, and communication? Melody Jew and others have recently offered the material heuristic interpretive lens of saturation, which is defined as adequate to situations where discrete objects, substances, and phenomena may be difficult to delineate. It involves an attitude of ontological openness wherein the filmmakers know all the substances, elements, agencies, or processes in advance, but rather explores what may co-saturate within a given situation. Indeed, what is perhaps most useful about saturation is that it can hold many different material and abstract senses together. The framework of saturation enables a trans-elemental imaginary that positions scholars to compare materials and social forces that might not otherwise find themselves in the same conversation. Thinking with the agency of the elements has long-standing precedence in indigenous epistemological and phenomenological traditions across lands, water, atmospheres, etc. A very quick example. 5 minutes? Okay. A very quick example during the Oki, storm, which happened in 2018, I think. The whole of Lakshadweep who were present on digital space would take selfies, saying "selfie with Oki," right? And there, and if you actually consider indigenous cosmologies of thinking about the coral reef, there is constant connection to the coral reefs, which are constantly invoked in the films that they are made now. In Lakshadweep cosmology, the coral reefs are seen as a kind of protective layer around the islands, and there's very interesting work that happens around this. So water, the coral reefs, the ocean ground, all of them acquire a very significant elemental presence in much of the contemporary filmmaking. And they evoke a coastal or literal imaginary oriented to and shaped by terrestrial, atmospheric, and aquatic phenomena. Yet coastalness is also an ongoing site of negotiation, and what Camus Braithwaite had called tidal dialectic or tidalectic in their formulation. An ending oscillation of waters that continually reshape the shore. This kind of, this sort of seascape epistemology is not a knowledge of the sea. Instead, it is some knowledge about the ocean and wind as an interconnected system that allows for successful navigation. In all this kind of reframing of the elements, the sea, the marine life, creatures, all of them emerge as narrative agencies capable of producing meaning through their communicative relations, enabling us to engage in collaborative storytelling activities. So to conclude, and to return questions about islandness in cinema, the Lakshadweep Island and the direction that I would like to take is to think about, how do these films, contemporary films, guide us towards a recognition of peripheral spaces and how they think, embody, sense, and create form and content. And also raises important questions about social imaginaries and politics that are local and geontological in the nodes in which they are produced. So to invoke Elizabeth Povinelli, who has worked, whose own work with the Caribbean Film Collective, who theorizes the relationship between extractive economies and filmic creations as counter-discursive, beyond the frames of representation, but as one of habituation. So, as a space, at the brink of both extraction and extinction in the climatic change challenges, there is growing attention to the critical foundations of connection in these films where people, things, ideas, legal systems could demonstrate the instability, the violence, and the invisibility at the very nodes of a very connected world that the state agencies tried to imagine through cinema. Thank you. I'm very happy. I couldn't show much of the films. I was trying to present everything in 20 minutes. But if there are any questions about, films made in Lakshadweep now, I'm happy to share. Yeah.
Thank you for these wonderful presentations. I enjoyed reading the papers and now the presentations. Not to summarize, but to just show the overlaps, I would say a few words. James' paper gives us this panoramic view about movie-going in the global south that goes beyond filling a gap in the study of cinema going during the colonial era in Mauritius, and sees the participation of local merchants in the movie business to understand the multiple choices available to Mauritius audience and media flow, and to document circulation of Bollywood in the South Asia diaspora in the late era. Debashree's presentation, to a certain degree, shares similar problem space as she grapples with challenges of tackling a lacuna in the history of cinema in Mauritius and circulation history in the study of Indian cinema. Yet, using relationality, stories, characters, and tropes that scholars call archipelagic poetics, following creative thinkers like Edward Glissant and Derek Walcott, Debashree takes a closer look at the affective embodied experience of a particular kind of migrant labor in Indian Ocean worlds through a Chinese film that Mauritius audience widely enjoyed in 1937. Though she focuses on Indian cinematic representational practices, which are akin, in her words, to colonial surveys, and on the shift in post-colonial imaginary of islandness in the Lakshadweep, Maldives, Chagos group of islands that is shaped by different historical processes than in Mauritius, Bindu took two approaches historiographic conundrum posed by nationalist frameworks of media histories. Theoretically, she shares archipelagic thinking with Debashree, albeit highlighting dialectical, or what she calls, following Hartweight, dialectical relationality between islands, waters, and shores, the ocean and the wind. That said, I would like to pose questions so that we can start the discussion that way, and I will open the floor. My first question will be to you, James. In your discussion, you said the movie business was run by local merchants with a keen interest in meeting the diverse tastes of their audiences. And you also said that your project is about cultural agency, about the ways in which local merchants and movie fans initiated and shaped global media flows. Given that the issue of taste raises questions of class stratification and reproduction of inequality, given that circulation was mediated by global, regional, local networks of merchants, how do you want us to understand your idea of cultural agency? As you take Laura Fair's work as a template, are you arguing that local merchants were at once invested in advancing the art form and in building community with a certain philanthropic sensibility, as Laura says? Even then, how can we discern capital accumulation and its legacy as evidenced in Rawat family business, which has now become giant in multiple areas, from telecom business to fast food, by closely working with the state?
So I'll thank you for that. I'll just start by saying there's an entire paragraph plus about the influence of Laura's book on my work, on this particular work. And the short answer is I have not been able to do the kind of close analysis that Laura was able to do in Zanzibar yet on Mauritius. So, so I don't have a good answer about the relationship, the role of class, of identity in the formulation of these audiences, in the network of people who controlled them. I came to the project with an interest in looking at alternatives to a kind of globalizing Hollywood, which as other papers have shown, is definitely something that's happening in Mauritius, but teasing out then the power relations within that process, I have not even begun to be able to tackle that. I mean, it's an outstanding question. It's the next logical thing to do in a project like that for what I'm working on. So I ducked the question.
No, thank you so much. Thank you. I know, your focus is in the 930s, the circulation, but my questions came from the extrapolation that I have observed in the paper. But this is, I know much is about to come, yeah, in all the works, I understand. To Debashree. Do the archives say anything about the reactions of the audience? If not, what methodology can we follow when we write from a deficient or archive or absences? You ended your discussion, even though we did not have really a chance, to listen to particularly your closing paragraph. Can you do that now? Yeah, because I really, that was where really, boils down the ways in which you have been building your arguments. It is there in the last two paragraphs. Can you do that? Oh, please. I'm giving you, the chance. The guys is not here. Timekeeper, no, we don't have any timekeeper now. Thank God. Yeah.
I was trained to be terrorized of the person sitting right in the front. So I just. Thank you so much, Surah, for reading so carefully, even though I sent the paper in so late. There's some of the kind of film analysis, poetics part of it, I was not able to do for the lack of time. Did you mean just the last two?
The last two paragraphs, I think, encapsulate what you really want to do.
So in the last 2 pages, what I was doing was I first described the film, and I talked about how the kind of focus that the film places on road building as an experiential form, and it also narrativizes exhaustion, physical exhaustion as a generational thing. So in the Chinese film, the road builder protagonist has parents who die working on a road mending crew gang. But he takes up this family profession, and that was a way for me to think about how can I read a 1930s audience thinking about perhaps a 50-year-old memory of a certain kind of work. So in the last paragraph, I also talk about roads as infrastructures that also undergird dreams of access. And then I'm just going to read out. Back in China or in India, the romanticization of workers was driven by various factors, such as on one hand, bourgeois nationalist visions of industrial self-reliance, and on the other hand, anti-imperial goals of collectivized state building. Infrastructure is key to both, and a pathway to dignity and freedom in both cases. In Highway, the film that I was looking at, the road building ensemble chooses this activity as a voluntary service to the nation, even though it's unpaid labor, and ultimately the entire ensemble cast, the characters die. This work kills them. But the road builders enjoy the psychic perks of dignity and pride. But in Mauritius or Fiji or South Africa, coolie spectators or their families didn't share this sense of ownership or agency with respect to the plantocracy or the bureaucratic regime. But the movies offer a glimmer of what voluntary collectivized labor could look like. And then I say I cannot make claims for exactly what local audiences thought of these films in Port Louis. But I can attest to their popularity because of the repeat reruns. The films keep coming back over years. But most importantly, the films connected workers across 2 continents, Africa and Asia, mediating tensions and desires, much as the ocean mediated these desires between them. And I'm hoping that an archipelagic poetics allows us to track China in Mauritius, even as it nudges us to think beyond place to an assemblage of globally resonating experiences of migration and labor. Thank you for letting me read this.
Of course. Check. Isn't it beautiful? And yeah. Yes. I see this grappling, you want to see how the audience would identify with these stories, even though these people are situated in 2 different historic time spaces. And I see, I was wondering, is she critically fabulating here? Is that a conscious methodology? Even you say that you are not claiming anything, but you are trying to understand. And at last you say that the coming together of these different people from various social classes, as James have been arguing in his previous works, is something in and of itself. I think that is the argument. But my question is, while this is great to do this stuff, but at the same time, what if you go beyond or out of the movie theater to understand what was going on in the society, to see the gendered, rest, classed relationship? Would that shed some kind of light in this kind of understanding without trying to get the truth through evidentiary kind of history?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that, so before this project, I've been working on Bombay cinema of the 1930s, and it's an archive of lost films. So for more than a decade, I've been working on films that I cannot ever watch. Maybe none of us will ever watch these films. So I have made my peace with absent things. And I no longer look for that first. So I wasn't even interested in seeing which was the first Indian film in Mauritius in that sense, though I'm dying to know, and I will keep looking for that. But it's not something that I want to theorize or think with. And I've never been really that interested in thinking about what audiences immediately, like how a film landed on a person, because I think those of us that do film studies know that films are highly unstable objects. Every person's experience of watching a film is different, but also every screening of a film is different. It sounds different, the print looks different. These are ephemeral histories. You can never recapture them in any kind of original truth. But I'm interested, therefore, in thinking about these resonating, recurring tropes, precisely by thinking about what are the social, historical, political conditions that help constitute this kind of a resonance across continents. So why is it that these road building, road mending movies are happening in all these different locations? And how is it that they're becoming so popular? So it is through that social, political, historical, and kind of particularities of different places that I'm trying to and hence I want to look at themes and tropes and certain historical figures like the road mender or the coolie, instead of saying the Chinese audiences loved the film in Mauritius in that sense, but clearly they also did. So just because the films made money and they kept coming back, but yeah, it's not critical fabulation in the sense I'm not building another narrative. I'm putting what already exists in the archive just next to each other in a particular kind of collage, which I hope will speak its own new thing. But I'm not making anything up.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is the last question, and I will open. I think you are desperate to ask questions to Bindu. I really loved the ways in which you have built your arguments and the examples that you have brought, and the theoretical, the conceptual mapping to grapple with this, histories is very fascinating. So I would like to just pose one question, which is related with your idea of saturation, particularly with your idea of agency of elements. We have this, yesterday someone raised this question about new materialism. I mean, in new materialism, as much as we are invited to consider objects, which we need to do, but this flattening of ontology that we observe in new materialism is very, very disquieting. Because thingness for an enslaved person, for people who have gone through colonialism, thingness is also personhood, because that is how we have been dehumanized. So we need to really complicate the idea of thingness matters. So when you say that this indigenous thinking about agency of elements, are you just presenting it as something precedent to what we have now, or does it shed a different kind of light in our understanding of matter, humanity? Thank you.
Okay, I'm always thinking. Thank you, that's a great question. So this was a very, very, it's a work which is being, it's in the formative, stages. And it's really the climate challenges and the conversations around climate challenges, which is unfolding in, everyday spaces, which made me think of these films differently. And then I saw a whole history, I'll come to your question, whole history of violence through the film form, right? Because there was almost no other possibility of cinema or any other kind of media until the whole black market of video and audio technologies emerged in the 1990s, right? It was all controlled by state agencies. So, and we're talking about territories where language, media in their language was unavailable, right? So the shift that I try to map is that how there is a recognition of and this is what I was trying to say when I talked about a reality, how there is a recognition of the islands as some kind of a deep geological time, and abstracting that into a state form. This is what the film distribution documentaries and other kinds of representations were trying to do in the in the times that I described. But very interestingly, the same elements then in the contemporary filmmaking, the earth, the water, their relationship with animals, all of which is not just a question of representation. Instead, they come alive as a question of habituation. So this film on the swells of Murambu, for example, are about surfers who surf and surfing trainers as well to those who visit. And it's a great surfing location. It's a global surfing location to which people have been visiting for a really long time. But the way in which the tides and the water are present in their lives is very different in which they appear in the travel vlogs or other kinds of material on the same thing. So by saturation, I did not mean new kinds of representation or idioms, but I really meant the way in which there is a habituation with elements and a very entangled life in which is very much describing their cosmology, the island cosmology, and also epistemology of living. So I can't emphasize about it much further, because what is lacking is my pending field work in the Lakshadweep Islands. Yeah, but this is what I meant, and not really as just materials and water as just a presence or idioms or metaphor or figures, etc. I really meant habitation of different elements with each other in the process of filmmaking.
Add something to that. I think also that it's very important in an Indian ocean studies room to think about the question you're asking, because there's a lot that is very seductive about new materialism's language. But I think precisely this question of those parts of the world and those humans, historical subjects, who have historically been dehumanized and reduced to things, commodities, objects. When you want to think objects and things alongside humans, to be able to think that shifting kind of status is just so important. So I completely support what you're gesturing towards, which doesn't mean that there's nothing of value in this philosophical field, but there's something we can bring to that in terms of nuance.
Absolutely. Yeah. The floor is now open. Who is going to give mic? Here, Dwight. And okay.
Let him go first.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Hello. Oh, can you hear me? Yeah. So my question is for Debashree and also James. To what extent can you think of cinema going as an exclusive activity? In particular, James, in the map that you showed of Mauritius, what was striking to me were the places where cinemas did not exist, because a lot of the cinemas exist in places like Vakwa or Gozil, these Mauritian towns that are historically very fairly affluent, but you don't, at least according to your map, you didn't find cinemas in the southwest of the island, which is an area where you have a lot of people who are descendants of slaves, and you have a lot of these historically impoverished communities. And so to what extent would actually going to a cinema involve, dressing up, traveling a long distance, and then being in a community around people who might look at you as if you don't belong there or might not want you there? And so that reminds me also of something that came up in Debashree's presentation, which is that, a lot of these ads for the films were in French and English, some in Hindi. So if someone was, say, a Creole person who was a laborer who spoke Mauritian Creole but didn't read it, that would already make these films inaccessible. So I wonder, to what extent might we think about cinema going as being something that's grafted onto the pre-existing ethnic but also social class inequalities of Mauritius? And then another point relates to, there was a second point I had, but anyway, it was about how, oh yes, in your presentation, Debashree, you showed this image of road building. And so it reminds me of how this is a time when certain forms of labor are seen as more useful. So road building being seen differently than than, say, subsistence farming. And so how might that play into this broader question of the exclusivity and the divisions that come out in cinema and also cinema going? So, yeah.
Well, I'll just real quick answer. The map I have on there, I've plotted, you can't really see it, but I've plotted against census data that the British government did, I think is from 1950, that identifies what they call Indian populations, to make exactly that point. And I came to this project from having done similar studies in Durban and in Trinidad, and in both of those places I've mapped it the same way, and it's exactly what you're describing. That the engine for bringing cinema are among relatively affluent populations. In Trinidad, in Guyana, that eventually integrates Creole populations into the cinema-going habit. In apartheid South Africa, that doesn't happen, or it happens in a very limited way, in a way that exactly what you're describing, that people who are legally identified as black in apartheid South Africa are permitted to go to film theaters like the Sharjah in Durban, but they don't feel comfortable because they're, because they're seen as kind of interloping. So it's that dynamic that you're hinting at. From what I can tell so far in Mauritius is absolutely there. Having seen it in Guyana, having seen it in Trinidad, having seen it in South Africa, as this project develops, I anticipate that. And that's part of the reason why I created the map the way I did, was really to underscore that. Having said that, one of the most interesting parts of this kind of research, and it's something that shows up in Laura's research and it shows up throughout the diaspora, is there's a whole kind of world of mobile cinema that is lost, really, or in danger of becoming lost, that may have been just as big or larger. If you're just interested in who's actually being exposed to this technology, there's this vast world of itinerant cinema that would go to villages that didn't have their own movie theater. And I fear a lot of that is lost, but I think a lot of working class populations perhaps had that opportunity, and we may just never know.
Thank you. So in terms of class access, I think it's safe to say that working class populations are watching these films in thousands. What is the racial segregation question of those working class audiences? That is just different. So for example, if I'm able to look at newspapers for evidence of where films were, how people found out, that's not the only way people were finding out about films, right? You could just pass by the theater. You may live in a particular part of the island, but you're working in another part of the island every day. So maybe in your lunch break or after work hours, you'll pop in because you're hot and sweaty, and sometimes there are fans in these places, right? So I think where people live, where they work, often the work happens in colonial places in the White Town, right? So, and the White Town then is where the movie theaters end up. There'll be like a bunch of movie theaters along one street in a movie district. And I'm saying this from just having studied the Bombay context and some other places. So I'm not exactly sure we can like map that question. So because people are also moving to different places to work, but the racial question is very different and interesting. And I think Laura Fair's work in Zanzibar, Tanzania, Ned Burtz's work, we do see that the Indian-owned theaters, there is a way in which there's certain kinds of racial segregations that take place. So, yeah. And also I think there's a lot of films that are not advertised that we will never perhaps know about. So a lot of local community groups organize film screenings like outside the church, in the school playground, and sometimes you just see images. So there's a lot of ways in which once a film print enters Mauritius, it moves across many hands. And it's really like used up. And it might die in that place because films die also just very material deaths. So yeah. Yeah, and the useful labor question, I think exactly because that narrative is of useful infrastructure building, that it is romanticized in the Chinese context and is romanticized by nationalists in India. But I think then thinkings from Mauritius or South Africa and indenture prevents that kind. You question this productivity rhetoric, right? So, and it's not internalized by these audiences, though it gets internalized by other audiences elsewhere. So, yeah, so I think exactly that's why plantation work, road building, this is all useful stuff, but useful for whom? So thinking from another location helps us temper that rhetoric. So.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed all of your papers. And Dwight stole the thunder from my question because I was going to ask something very similar. Not so much about film, the habits of going and film, watching. I was thinking back on television watching. And the question I had for you is, to what extent, especially James, you've done comparative work in different contexts. I mean, to what extent are the 49 cinemas or theaters in Mauritius a factor of what other entertainment was or was not available versus other contexts? I mean, I remember when I was growing up, we didn't have a television. Television was new. The neighbors had it, and so we all went to the neighbors. And at some point, the family forced my dad to go and buy a black and white TV. There was one channel, Doordarshan, and we all as a family and everybody around would watch it on Thursday evenings for the movie. The some of you will know this. The Hindi movie film songs. They only had a film song program on Thursday nights. What was it called? Does anyone? There you go. Right. And then I think it was either Saturday or Sunday that they had the full-length feature film. We watched it regardless of whether we liked it or not, because that was the only game in town, right? So that's one thing. So in other words, to what extent can we really say that these audiences went to these movies because they really enjoyed them and they really, appreciated the road and, all of that? And to what extent was there just not much else to do? And to what extent was, was it maybe talking about class? To what extent was it a sign of, prestige, privilege, whatever? It's like some people go to McDonald's in certain countries as a sign of privilege and prestige, right? So that's the consumption question. Lastly, the final question is, to what extent might these films be cultivating a particular kind of taste? In other words, while I remember the Thursday evenings as kind of a forced presence at those TV sessions with the family because everybody had to be there. Today, now, I look back on it very nostalgically because I remember those songs from those old days. When I hear them, I think about family, I think about... So there was a certain kind of cultivation of taste that was taking place that I was not even aware of as a 12-year-old. Anyway, thank you.
Is this a panel question? So it's a panel question. Yeah, I thought it's a panel question. Okay.
Any of us can answer.
So it's, yeah. So all the references to, Doordarshan, I think, has pushed me to respond. So, cinema, I mean, it's, all of us would agree is much more than the text, right? It's also it's a space, it's also, larger leisure practices, I mean, tied to consumption, leisure, all of that. But to think about the power of it, there are innumerable examples, which I'm sure between all three of us, we can just easily provide. I'll just provide one, which is, I know very, very closely. 1926, the cashew and coir workers, women in Kollam in Kerala, strike work because because the show timings were not aligning with their factory timings, right? They struck work. So that explains a lot about, leisure and consumption. Everyone wants it, right? So it's not as if, they were just going. It has a semiotic function, which I think it's much more than the text and the space and everything. It's everything together. So about Doordarshan, while Doordarshan was also, I mean, especially when all of us know this, that was the only available form of television in India till the 1990s. But particularly the island context that I looked into, the Doordarshan is part of the slow violence on on Lakshadweep Islands, right? Because they don't know Malayalam, they don't know Hindi. I mean, they knew Malayalam a little bit because of trade, transactions, movement to the mainland is through Kerala. That's where they come to study, etc. But it's still, it took many years. Took until recently, there was no Lakshadweep language programming available on Doordarshan. Right? So by that time, they have also been very acclimatized with both Hindi and Malayalam programming. So Doordarshan, yes, it was only available form, but it's important to remember that it was also a very important state form. So yeah, I'll pass it on to Debashree. She will have a lot to.
I'll just say real quick about people going to watching what's available. I wrote my first book based on educational films made by British administrators for Africans in Central Africa. And I watched hundreds of these films, and they are the most boring, incredibly tedious films you could have possibly imagined. And people would walk miles to see them, and when they would interview them afterwards, they'd say, well, it was lit, everyone was going to be there. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's such a visual medium when that's all you have to do, whether it be watch one of the 3 TV channels. I grew up the same way. I think it's impossible to figure out what effect films had on people by and large, but I think the social experience of participating and going to cinema together is profoundly important culturally. I go back to these social media pages which have this incredible outpouring of nostalgia for cinema. And it strikes me that cinema is one of the few things often, especially when you're doing interviews in Africa, that people, when you ask them about their experience living in a colonial context, cinema is something they're amazingly nostalgic about and positive about. So I don't think we can know what effect they had. I agree 1,000%. People would just go see what was available, what was on. TV, as you know, came very late to a lot of these places too. If you look at, in Guyana in the 1980s, you had to go to the movies to see Bill Bixby as the Incredible Hulk because it wasn't on, because they didn't have television. So, a lot of, especially in the Caribbean, didn't get TV until the 1980s. So, whereas, 1948 was the peak year for Americans going to the movies. After that, TV just completely ate into that market. Jamaica, Trinidad, it's the 60s, it's into the 70s. So I think very often people writing from a North American context don't recognize the durability and the power of cinema long after it's kind of waned in the West.
I think it's all been said, but I just will quickly say that, yes, of course. I mean, in Bombay, in the turn of the century, people's main pastime when they didn't have money was hawa khana, eating air, which was what going to the closest public space, just hanging out. So of course movies were that space, but I think it's also a temporal thing. It's also a bit of an underestimation of audiences, right? To say, oh, they'll watch anything. I mean, Adorno and Horkheimer said it, right? Housewives are going to the movies to just cool down or just to be not bothered by their family or their husbands. So of course there is that social aspect of it. But by the mid and end, late 30s, these are people that are cinephiles. A lot of them are actively, like they have their favorite actors, they're going and talking about film, they talk about good films and bad films and why this wasn't as good as the last film. Not that this is any kind of way of me saying that these are good films, this is good cinema, but people are adjudicating those questions amongst themselves. So this is much more than. So it can be all those things, I think, together.
Do we have time? Good. So, Nidhi. And
thank you so much for this incredible panel. I'm still sort of wrapping my head around a lot of the connections between the papers. And one thing that really struck me was also thinking through sort of, what are the possibilities of this kind of cinema watching? And I'm thinking specifically of Pramesh Lalu's work in South Africa on this one theatre, Kismat, that he writes about and has made a film about, that, became a space of sort of, a cinema watching as a kind of way of imagining a future beyond apartheid, right? And I'm thinking specifically of your, the Mauritian context where, of course, you have these Chinese films, you have the Indian films that are, of course, deeply nationalist and are coming from a specific history. But how does sort of also thinking of that circulation in Mauritius or in different parts of, I mean, beyond Mauritius too, I've heard this in East Africa, I've heard this from folks and watching, films in Egypt that are circulating at the same time. But how does that kind of nationalist framework that's coming from different parts actually allow for or sort of articulate with local imaginaries of possibilities beyond indenture, right? Possibilities of nationalist movements in the context itself, right? So even with Mauritius in the 1930s, what is going on around, right? I think that goes also back to Surafel's question around what is the kind of political movement at the time, because Mauritius gets independence in the 1960s, but what's going on in the 1930s that makes not just the end of indenture, but possibilities for the future, right? In terms of why certain films resonate or circulate in particular ways, yeah.
So would you give the mic to?
Thank you. Bindu, you began very provocatively by saying something about the non-nationness of the island. And I want to apply something that Debashree said to that comment about the difference between place and world making, particularly when thinking of islands and peripheral, places in the Indian Ocean world and specifically with India as a nation. What are the flashpoints of failure when one thinks of the possibility of nationness or non-nationness, especially when it comes to film and interpolating a place into the imaginary of making the nation through the circulations of television and film making possibilities, right? Where Kashmir, the Northeast, Goa, and Lakshadweep, Andaman and Nicobar Islands are both inside and outside the nation, right? And then for Debashree and James, you both touched on the specter of American influence through cinema. And I couldn't help but notice, Debashree, that there was a screening of Charlie Chan in Paris. So while on the one hand, you're talking about this Chinese film, here's this yellow face film. and I wonder what, actually pressing you through Sura's question to fabulate, on what that might mean. And then finally, this wonderful comment you made about modernity and labor reminded me of the Black Atlantic, where Gilroy says, Black people, enslaved Black people, were the first to handle in the emotional issues that we now consider so prevalent, right, in our sense of modernity. So what does cinema do in terms of connecting labor and affect in the circulations that you are considering? Thank you.
Okay, so Nidhi, yeah, thanks for all these great questions. I mean, this is really work in progress. This is all very helpful. So in terms of the nationalist frames of the films that are coming in, I would say that it's a very variable kind of a form, right? So there's a lot of the films that are being made in 1930s Bombay, which is a time when independence is imminent. By this time, it's a no-brainer. This is going to happen. It's on the horizon. When is the question? But even those films are not all nationalist in the sense that they're not always imagining a horizon of a nation state even. So one of the things that I've tried to do in the Bombay book is to say that this is a period where cinema has many visions of futures and possibilities for the self that far exceed ideas of nation. A lot of the futures are about freedom. And freedom is also understood variously. It's not always political freedom. It's freedom for the self, which can also just mean mobility. It can mean one day I will wear a fashionable sari, right, with like a puff sleeve blouse. So the kinds of films that are coming in are promising many different visions of future possibilities for the self, which are visions of modernity, where that modernity is not always overlapping with a sense of political nation state kind of modernity. At the same time, there is a very interesting kind of way in which the more politically active Mauritian Indians view cinema. They don't think cinema is a good object. And actually, it's been interesting that a lot of the more kind of Hindu platforms with very active political publishers, they just abstain from having cinema ads. And this is very much the case in India as well. They are not interested. Cinema is a very corrupt form, and it's for plebeians, and they are being seduced in all these ways. So the Hindu nationalists who are actively working and mobilizing in Mauritius from the turn of the century are not interested. So they will have ads for other kinds of things. So there's a whole other kind of politics, I think, over there. And for Bene, yes, I really wanted to think about Charlie Chan in Paris alongside Highway, right? So this Hollywood version of like Orientalism and Yellowface, alongside films coming from, with a revolutionary kind of zeal coming from China. I definitely want to kind of pursue that. Yeah, I'll just stop there.
Thanks, Vinay. That's a really good suggestion. I really don't have an answer for that question. Also, because I see um, what um, what has cinema done in Lakshadweep? I don't think I have explored enough, or anybody has explored enough, right? So the what films division and the state agencies. So it's also a very tension-filled space. Cinema was not a good object in Lakshadweep as well, right? So the initial screenings and the first 20 years of the Indian state screening films has been mostly for the mainland employees living there, right? So so Lakshadweep itself opens up to cinema in a latter phase, in that sense. With video technologies coming in, so it really needs more work to know what kind of film material circulated from the 90s onwards, what films were they watching, and so on, to really understand what happened to this project. So I think that the Indian state project of screening films did not include the islanders for a really long time, right? Also because there was a understanding that the islanders were not welcoming cinema at all. These are anecdotal, kind of stuff that I receive in the field. So there isn't. I've not been really able to understand this, because that's something which I would like to explore further. But it's a really good question. How did cinema work in these peripheries? What failed? What was taken? And what was, reworked, reframed? All these questions. And was it an entire failure? I don't know. So I need to think about it. Thank you.
Just one comment I'd make about the question of nationalism and kind of the degree to which these cinemas cultivated a sense of cultural difference. I think it's also worth remembering that the cinema house was so much more than just a place you saw movies. And if you look at South Africa, Trinidad, they were places of political organization. They were spaces, as you see in Laura's book, where women could go and have and be apart from the rest of the community. So I think the cinema as a space is really more important than the films that are shown, and many scholars have, I'm sure looked at exactly this, that the cinema house is a new kind of public space, and I think that's a huge part of what I want to investigate in Mauritius, is how are those negotiated. I know from my research in Trinidad and South Africa, they were very much politicized. So I'm anticipating I'll find a similar dynamic.
Last round, any question? Okay, it seems low. Of course, please.
Thank you. So wonderful panel, great papers, so thank you all. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the physical circulation of these films. Do you know anything about, the Chinese films and how they physically got to Mauritius, or how films circulated from theater to theater or from theater to the mobile cinemas? So again, the physicality of moving these very heavy objects across oceans and through towns and around to rural communities.
I have a lot of great anecdotal stuff so far that doesn't really form a complete picture. As I mentioned, I know that the connection to East Africa and coming over in regular shipments from Mombasa. I have so much fascinating anecdotal description about people taking donkey carts with cinemas and taking them along from, one of these companies might own 3 cinemas and the same film would just be taken by cart from cinema to cinema. So absolutely that's how it's happening. I just haven't quite put the whole thing together, but definitely it seems like the East Africa connection has become the main source of films by the late 40s for sure. Now initially, I think they're coming from South Africa, and I think that shifts later. But yeah, it's just people racing from theater to theater to make sure 2 audiences can see the same film in the same night.
No, and this is a phenomenon that you see elsewhere. So for example, when I was working in Bombay, way back when, I actually interviewed some people who were making movies at the time, and they were projectionists. And they said as late as the 1980s, early 90s, there were these people that were called runners, right? So they would just take a cycle or a bike or an auto, they would go from theater to theater, right? So this is happening everywhere. I'm also interested in, are they coming via, where are these films coming from, and what are the shipping routes, etc., etc. But in terms of physicality, one of the things I will pursue is the status of Mauritius in film geopolitical territories. So films that get there, why is a film that was released on January 1st, 1935 in Shanghai, playing here in 1937? Because it had done its time. It was a smash hit in China. It had done its time, and by the time it got here, the print would have been worn, it would have been scratched, right? And so we have found instances of audiences in Fiji and South Africa writing to studios saying, can you send us a clean print? But nobody cares about them. This is not a lucrative market, right? So there is that other kind of way in which films actually go to some places to die because they've done their run elsewhere. So this is, after 2 years, it'll come here. A film will be playing after 4 years over here. And they'll be scratched up and poor quality and all of that.
Yeah. So, so it's interesting that there is this whole idea of the second run, right? Which is a third run also, which is so if you look at the Indian film market, for example, the less lucrative circuits won't get there, especially in the 30s and 40s. And this I'm talking about, the trade circuits in Kerala and so on. Huge complaints about how it's only scratched and rundown films coming here. So it's not that the lucrative ones would get the first print. They will there is a lag, right? So it's a temporal, it's physical what happens to the copy, but it's also temporal. It comes a little later. So that could be the case perhaps with Mauritius. I mean, you also said the Chinese film was released in 1935, but it comes to Mauritius in 1937. So yeah, that I suppose that could be one thing to explore. About Lakshadweep, as I understand, and then I've come across some real the internet was my friend. And I've come across this footage of the Doordarshan crew shooting in the ship in and around the coral reefs and things like that. So it had to be water mediated. Everything had to travel by water. The cameras, the cameramen, the projection equipment, the screen, and everything traveled by water. And so, of course, there were sort of permanent projection facilities set up, but small number across this. So it's a set of 35 islands. Not all of them are inhabited. The main ones like Minicoy and Kavaratti, etc., will have projection facilities, and they would be taken around for screening, school buildings. So early modes of film screening that continue till the 1980s. Currently, the Lakshadweep, audience is tied to the audio-video market in the coastal line of mainland Kerala. This is their source of. So cities like Cochin and Mangalore, port cities, to which they are connected, is their source of audiovisual material as well. Also, it's also in the ship route. So it is also said that some of these goods also come via. But it's not a regular route where there are haven't heard of anything like that there is a regular supply, but it's also in the ship route. So so completely physically mediated. The water is the main conduit for all kinds of goods.
No burning question like Laura's? No? Oh, we are so generous today. I would like to end this wonderful panel here. Tabiti, you may take the floor and... Good. To lunch. Thank you, the panelists.
Thank you for being
so
a great
much.
discussant, a very kind discussant.